So, welcome everyone. Welcome for joining my session, a last-minute addition. So, there are a few rough edges still on these presentations. First time prepared it in like, 24 hours. So, but I hope you will learn a few things around Jakarta EE integration testing. So first of all, who is using Jakarta EE applications? Hopefully everyone? No? Who is using Jakarta EE? Few people? Okay. Because it is specific for Jakarta EE, what I'm going to say. And the examples are with Jakarta EE, but you can probably learn, of course, a few things, as there are also some frameworks that can be used with other technologies, of course. So for questions, you can always ask me questions afterwards, but there is also a tool, an application, or how should I call it, as Slido, so where we have GeeCON 2022 as your code, so that you can join and prepare your questions. I'll come to them at the end of the talk and see if there is anything that you want to know. Maybe a general question. I don't always test, but if I do it in production. Who is doing that also? Or maybe, yeah, I see a few hands, they are very brave. Thank you for admitting it. And probably you test some code, but not all code, I guess. Not every line is tested. That's fine. We all do it, including me. But of course, that can be a little bit tricky. Because not all bugs are obvious, like this one. In this sentence, there are 3 errors. You spot immediately 2 errors, but where is the third one? The statement that there are 3 errors, because there are only 2 errors. So it's not always obvious what is wrong, and you don't see it as a developer because you have written your code yourself, and you're blind for the issues that you have put into your code. Don't blame yourself. I'm having the same issue. I'm blind for my own errors, and I'm saying, what a stupid guy that I am after hours of debugging, find the stupid thing that I always overlooked. So we always expect, of course, the best. We are super developers. We only write perfect code, but we should plan for the worst and prepare to be surprised that, oh, everything works from first time in production without any issues. And we have some tools, unit testing, which is nice, but integration testing should be better, especially this photo is not that clear, but you have in the corner 2 windows and the handles block each other, so you can actually not open any kind of window. But unit testing was fine, because when it was not placed in the walls, then of course the handle works perfectly. Unit testing is important. You will see that also in a moment when I give some guidelines of what people say that you should do. But don't always trust on unit test. You should always have some kind of integration testing, which is, of course, not the easiest one. For those that don't know me, I'm Rudy De Busscher. I'm Jakarta EE expert, whatever that may be, they gave me the name. I'm owner of @bash, so I'm trying to work with people to help them in their Jakarta EE experience. So I'm also involved in the Jakarta EE as a committer and microprofile. And one of my favorite topics is security. Yes, those people exist. You see there also my Twitter handle and the blog if you're interested in a few things. Not going into deep, but just few naming things. You all know that the different types of different types of testing, unit testing. You have integration testing. Actually, I call system testing also integration testing because that's what I mostly do. If you test a completely fully integrated product, integration testing actually is where you combine a few parts or components. You don't need to have a full-blown product that you're testing or application that you're testing. Acceptance testing is most of the time a manual thing, and it's a good thing that people go over it and do a few things, like the baby test. You know, the baby test, just put in anything and it breaks, guaranteed. And then the release testing, well, that actually is the user who is testing your application in production, which I'm a bit, surprised that these days if I use some tools on the internet that actually I'm the tester. So then I'm thinking, well, I should be paid for providing you all those feedback why it does not work. Even as an example, I tried to do my online check-in to the flight to here, and that just failed. He says, I could not find your ticket. I was thinking, oops, is there something wrong or what's going on with my ticket? So don't wait until the user says it's not working. So integration testing, system testing is important, but we all know it's quite realistic, so you can have a good idea, but it's slow, brittle, and you don't like to write all those tests, of course. Unit testing, on the other hand, is fast and easy, but sometimes they are not always business related. What I mean by that is that, and that's a bit the problem with those tools that we have to test the how many lines, the line coverage or statement coverage, whatever. So people are just trying to get to 100%. They just want green test. If they are relevant or not, they just want to have something so that it's green and it's more than 80% or something. And that's one thing, but you should always look at, is this test, this unit test, what I'm writing, is that related to what people can pull in, put into fields? Is that something that is requested in a feature, etc. So unit testing, a good thing, but be aware that you're not testing to have test, but that you have something meaningful. You have also seen this pyramid. You have unit testing, then the integration testing or component testing, API testing, whatever they call it, and then some GUI testing. And because it always becomes more difficult to test and to keep it stable, etc., they say something like use 70% unit testing, 20 integration testing, and 10 GUI testing. And since you have that pyramid looks a bit like a mountain, you have a high mountain of tests, so there is always clouds around the top. You need to do manual testing because, sometimes manual testing, if you have a good test plan, find some things. Good, that was testing, just to set the stage. So remember, unit testing are good, but be aware of some pitfalls. Integration testing is a must, so that you can deploy on Friday and go and come back on Monday and still everything is working fine. Title is Exploring Integration Testing with Jakarta EE. Few people mentioned that they are working with Jakarta EE, so you know that, for instance, at the Jakarta EE 10, which was officially released, I think now about a month ago, you have a bunch of specifications for all kinds of areas of your enterprise application, going from business logic to security, to validations, etc. But where is that testing? Don't you need to test with the Jakarta EE? So I would like to have testing 1.0 in Jakarta EE 11. Will probably not happen, but I'm playing around already with 4 or 5 years with some ways of having testing within or testing your Jakarta EE application. What are the best What are the best ways? So maybe one day my dreams come true and then I have some testing in some version of the platform. Yes, I love that, if that would be the case. So what will I cover today are 4 things how you can do some kind of integration testing with Jakarta EE today. So you don't need to wait until there is something in the specification. And the idea of that Jakarta EE specification is always, let's try to standardize something which is already available in the world, which is proven itself. So let's have a look at the 4 things. Maybe there are more. These are the 4 things that I know what you can use to have integration testing. So look at those 4 things, and I mention a few pros and cons of each of those 4. You don't need to agree with me. We can have a discussion later, or this evening, or whatever, at whatever time. But that's my opinion, my humble opinion around those 4 frameworks. First of all, what I want to look is Weld. Weld is, since not everyone is aware of Jakarta EE, Weld is the implementation of the CDI specification. So where you create your beans, where you have your manager to maintain all the dependencies within your logic that provides you the implementations of other kind of dependencies for your services. So Weld has a JUnit extension. Not that many people know it, and it is quite a nice thing because it is already an old thing. The first release was around 2016. Depends what you call the first release, because some project stays forever in the 0. whatever version and then not go to the 1.0 because then they say, "Ooh, now we are final and we can't do major changes anymore, and I don't want to be restricted." But anyway, it's already a long time around, but not that many people know it. The idea of unit testing with Weld JUnit is that you spin up the CDI container, so you spin up a component which is also used at the end when your application goes live. And instead of putting everything in that container, like not super familiar with Spring, but you can also limit there or what kind of beans you put in the Spring container. You can also put a limited set of CDI beans in that container, which is, according to the definition, as we have seen, that's also an integration testing. You don't need to test your entire application, but a limited set is also fine. And yeah, you also probably know what mocks are. So we can, few of those CDI beans, those dependencies, those external dependencies, maybe we can mock them so that we don't need live versions of the database running, live versions of our other microservices maybe that are running or that are consulted for our specific case that we have. It's demo time. I always try to defeat the demo gods, but I'm not actually going to type a lot of code because that only is making them angry. So I'm going to use prepared code, but that you're probably, most of you are developers, so code says more than boring slides. So, as I mentioned, Weld has a JUnit extension. The version 4 here is the one which is compatible with the new release Jakarta EE 10. If you're still on Jakarta EE 8, then that's fine. There is version 2. Don't know it by heart, so that's one compatible. Version 3 of this framework is EE 9.1 compatible. So it's the JUnit 5 extension, so we need JUnit Jupyter. As I said, we are going to use mocks, so I'm using here Mockito for that. And this is the dependency that we need for our Java application or our Jakarta EE application, so that we can write our code. I have chosen to use the same application 4 times. So I've mentioned those 4 frameworks. This is the first one, and I'm always using the same bits of code, not that super complex, but tries to demonstrate what it is, what I'm trying to show you. If you have a certain amount for a loan that you want to lend 15,000 euros or whatever whatever that is here in Czechia, for a period of a number of years, and of course, depending on the interest rate, you need to pay a certain amount per month to fulfill your debts. That's not that most difficult one of code, but that's already some code, and we have an external dependency. For the moment, I have here, let's call it a external service, which we'd like to consult to give the actual interest rate. We are not that high, but we are not far from it, at least not in Belgium. It's hard-coded here now, but actually we are going to mock it, so we are not actually going to use this value, but later on you will see that we can even mock this one with a real JAX-RS return value or REST value later on. So how can we create an integration test for it? So meaning an integration test is that we want to test this method, but it has some external dependency. So you cannot really unit test it because through that injection, or think auto-wired for those people who are aware with who knows more about Spring. So how can we test that? So there is that JUnit 5 extension for Weld, as I said. So we need to indicate that on our test. Hopefully everyone is familiar with JUnit 5 now. Who is not familiar with JUnit 5 is still using JUnit 4? Okay, not much hands, so that's a good thing that people are moving to JUnit 5 because it is a great tool. So we are extending this functionality of the standard JUnit 5 testing, and one of the things that you need to do is then define our CDI container, what will be deployed on the container. As I mentioned, you define, for instance, that only the CDI beam for this class is there. So that's our class on our test. But we can also then inject even immediately that class into our test. So we can have access to that CDI beam fully operational with all the dependencies. Oh, but wait, we had here the dependency on this version here. So on this other class, so I will mock that. So I will create a mock bean. That's again done with Mockito here. For those people who are using JMock is the other popular one, I think. You can do something similar, where I mock this class, and every time I call get current value, I actually hard code the return value to 6.99. And not even I create that mock, but I also define it as a CDI bean by this mock bean builder from Weld JUnit. So my CDI container has 2 beans, the one that we are testing and the one that we have dependency on that we for this here hard-coded. So that means that we can just test our method by providing an amount in years, we get an amount back, and then with assert j tests, I check if that expected value is actually what I got back here, the assertion value is back. So you can run that. It runs relatively fast because it's not using that much, so it's always a good thing that it runs fast. It is a green test, so we are happy it is working. But yeah, I need to test other values. I need to test my edge cases, like what if I specify a negative number for amount or even 0 and those kind of things. So I want to repeat that. I want to repeat that test, so I'm not going to duplicate this over and over this test. So you have a repeated test, a parameterized test in JUnit 5. And I give here an argument, and because we have multiple arguments, I decided to use a class where I can specify that value that we want at the years, at the interest rate, and the expected value that we return from our test. So I can put that in one object. I have then a provider for that JUnit 5 so that I test multiple values. So yeah, I'm testing another value than 6.99 so that I know that this is not hard-coded, so that I have some variance in it. Okay. But if I have a value, a negative value, well, by specifying this, the specification said that if the arguments are not correct, then we should return not a number as a result of our method. So I'm trying out of this work. There is one thing that you need to know before this works with well JUnit, because well JUnit also tries to provide CDI beans in this case for this class. So there is a bit of conflict. So you need to just to say explicit parameter injection. For the rest, it is the same, but our mock bean is now it's not really a mock anymore. It is, so I should call it a spy, I think it's the name, so that I can give it a value and that it just returns that value. And so when we run this test, and you see from my previous test that this was already in error, because of course I did not take into account that in my test here that the value could be negative, so that test here that fails. So well, JUnit, I find it a very nice tool for testing your business logic. Your business logic is written in the CDI beans, and in sometimes people call it services or whatever. So you can test that, and you can provide easily your dependencies through that mocking and spy stuff. Good. One thing solved. One framework tested or demoed. Next one is Archillion. From the website, we learn executing real tests. I like to challenge that. I do not entirely agree with it. It started in 2011, 2012. That's more or less the first release, as I said. What is the first release? But it was indeed the first real attempt of integration testing of something which was rather complex. You see, we are struggling already with that for more than 10 years. The highlights in red there are my statements where I have an issue with. Because for Archillion, you assemble. You don't test your entire application. You assemble a few dependent classes with another tool which was used, is shrink wrap. It's a nice tool, so you can create on the fly programmatic a WAR file or jar file with certain classes in it, etc. But what I have issues with is that what are you testing? Are you now testing that assembly? or are you testing your real-world application? For those that knows the what is it, the 12-factor application thing, is that you should not that you should move your application unaltered from development to test to production. Well, then this is not compliant to that. Another thing that I always find strange is that your tests are, or you have the option by default, but that you're executing your test inside the container. So within that shrink wrap, you also add a bunch of other frameworks, those testing frameworks, to make it that possible and to have the communication with your JVM who is running outside and performing those tests. So it's a lot of stuff happening. You can have sometimes a lot of issues to make it work. And yeah, so I'm not really sure that that is the way to go. But it works. And I prepared this time then an Orchillion example with Glassfish. First of all, you need quite a long Maven dependency project for that. You need quite a lot of dependencies. This is the dependency management section, so let's go down here. So you have then that Orchillion also for JUnit 5. That's what they created. You need to able to deploy your application. You need also cargo for that, etc., etc. There is a lot going on, a lot of configuration stuff, which can be very confusing if you do it by hand. So or first time. So there is. It's not the official Eclipse Jakarta EE starter, but there is a guy who, I guess, spent his entire lifetime keeping that those examples up to date. It's a starter application, so you can just download this application, and you have with profiles for every major runtime. You have not only an example of how you can use a certain thing, but also how you can use that Orchillion there with completely working examples, etc. So that's very nice. We should give that guy a medal for that. And I mean that in a positive way. Don't get me wrong. So we have our application. Again, we have the same application. We have here also that external service, but not really external still, because I'm going to mock it again. And how can we mock it this time? Because, as I said, we assemble an application, a WAR file or a jar file. In this case, we can do a jar file because we don't testing the EXRS endpoint. And we can just include a class. So we cannot really include a mock because a mock is created at the runtime. So what we can do then is we call it a fake or a spy, as I said. Again, a class that we extend, the official one we extend, and we can set there a value that is returned as the current value for the interest rate. And since it is CDI, we need to define it as specializes so that it overrides this bean. So this one is not used. Okay, we are using, or we can use the same rate, but actually this one is used. And the test is then extend with the Orchillion extension. We create the deployment. As I said, we need to specify which classes are packaged. And some additional things are packaged that we don't see, and that can maybe the problem, because we put a lot of other classes in the jar file. We also can inject the bean under test, and we can also inject that fake one so that we can actually set the value. So that's a nice one, because this test is actually, as I said, running within the server. So we can have that access to that bean. We calculate it. I again made a mistake that assert J is not available on the server, so and it's not packaged in the jar file, so we cannot use it. That way of searches, only the JUnit one. And I'm so used to us using a J, and then you get a very cryptic error because everything is running on the server and not on the JVM, which actually launched the test. So that is one of the issues that I also have with Archillion. It is not that friendly if something goes wrong. If it works, it's nice, but if it does not work, you can lose quite some time. So if you run this, you can also run it as a Maven integration test, of course, but I'm just going to start it up here. It starts up, in this case, the Glassfish container, Glassfish 6, which is EE 9.1 compatible. And it deploys that jar file, it executes this test within it and returns the result to your testing framework. And yeah, hooray, it works. Nice. But as I said, I have a few issues with it. Besides that, Archillion is maybe not that active anymore. So since 2018, so that's already 4 years now, there is almost no activity. And version 1.7 is in alpha, so they have released alpha 1 in April 2020. They are now at alpha 12, so I'm wondering when they are doing beta and final of that version. If they keep up this rate, it will be in 2028. As I said, because I'm going to post the slides later on so that you can also have that link to that GitHub repo where you can get that EE9 starter with all the boilerplate to get that working. To summarize the issues that I see, you don't deploy a real WAR file, so what are we testing? We are not actually testing functionality of our application. For each runtime, we need to have a connector. So if the Wildfly guys, the Open Liberty guys, the Payara guys, Glassfish guys don't keep up those connectors, then you cannot deploy your application anymore. So that's also an issue. And for me, it is a bit complex because you assemble all those required classes and error information can get lost. I like simple things, sorry. I did not know. I was looking this up this weekend and I was thinking, oh wow, Testcontainers is already released in 2016. Who knows Testcontainers? Okay, quite a few hands because it's really a nice thing. So I go quickly over this because you all know it. Components are running in a Docker container, easy integration of your components, blah, 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 etc. And I find it 12-factor application friendly because you just deploy your application under test and you test it from the outside, so it is as the users are testing it, but it is a nice one. So you all know that you can have then a repeatable test because you are using real systems. You can have database and monitoring there. You can use Selenium to verify front end, etc. You can even simulate a cluster on your single computer, etc. if you're running Docker locally, as I'm doing, for example. So this is the standard way how you work with test containers. Again, you have an annotation at test containers, which is actually an alias for, if you can call it an alias for extend with that JUnit 5. And then you define two containers in this case. The first one is a database. The second one is a generic container with my application. So you need to have your Docker image available before you can use test containers. So that's one thing that it's not a real issue, but some additional things that you need to do, which might maybe be improved. We can ask for the endpoint because the container IP address, we probably don't know it, and as you probably also know, the ports are not the original port, so if your application is running on port 8080, it might be exposed on another port here locally. So we are asking which port we can use to access our application, and then we can just call that endpoint and we can get the URL data as a string, etc. I like to use real objects. But it is nice because as you see here, your test is running locally on JVM, you deploy your application in one container. Another component, like your database, is also available on that same Docker host. And there are two frameworks which try to simplify those things that I mentioned with test containers. The first one is microshed testing. So it's from the microprofile specification. First released in 2019, based on Jakarta EE8, but actually more or less abandoned because there is no activity for 2 years. And there are a few things. It is simplified, but again, it relies on the fact that runtimes like Payara, Wildfly, OpenLiberty, etc., create a connector, create an integration between microshed testing and the runtime. And if people need to do something specific, then it works great for a few years, but then they say, well, we are not doing that work anymore, so it is more or less abandoned. But there are some nice ideas. I helped with microshed testing because it was a microprofile, and I expanded on it, and so I decided, let's say half a year ago, so why not put all the knowledge that I have around the test containers and that microshed, why not create something? And I call it integration testing. And it supports EE8 and higher, so also the new EE10. It is more flexible. You can use it for testing multiple applications, so a microservice environment. And an addition which is not yet released, which I started a few weeks ago, like a month ago, is that you can use wire mock for mocking dependencies. So our interest rate service which provides that 6.99 there, we can then say that we can configure that wire mock returns it so that your code actually does the HTTP call to something. As I mentioned, this is the app itself under test with test containers, so that's nice. That integration testing framework has already support for Payara Micro, OpenLiberty, Wildfly, and Glassfish, so that's are the main four ones which are running in Jakarta EE. I know there are others, but they are not really Jakarta EE certified, but I could try to add them, of course. You can use dependencies just like test containers and like databases, but your own custom images also, and that wire mock for remote services. Quickly, the microshed one, because then I can explain something. You need two dependencies there. You need a core dependency for test containers, the microshed testing containers, and then you have a specific connector for Payara Micro. As I said, each vendor has its own connector. And again, that's my annotation for a JUnit 5 extension. No, the microshed one in this case. You define your container by just saying, I have an application container, and based on that connector, it knows what it needs to create and instantiate. And this is a nice one. This is coming from microprofile REST client. Similar things are available also, of course, in other, it's using things which are also available in Spring. I think it's called Spring Slut or something like that. So that you have an interface where you define your YAXRS endpoints, and that it injects here a working version, a proxy, which actually call that remote endpoint, which is then here in that running in that container. And yeah, we can test that, but you see, we don't have the capability here of defining what it needs to return. So that 6.99 is a bit hard-coded here, so you don't have really the capabilities what you should have. It failed last time, so because it was red here. So let's try it again. Let's defeat the gods. So we are running on test containers. You see everything starts up. Payara Micro starts within the container. You see the log output there, so that's also nice. So no hidden errors. that you need to search for a long time, and yes, it is green, so nice. But as I said, I want to extend on that. Using that kind of way of working, that REST client I found very useful. But that connector thing was not that useful, and as I said, you cannot really put other dependencies. And debugging, when you see your test failing, but you have no idea why your test failed, so maybe that's also a nice option. So it's used here micro-profile dependency, but you can use any. You can also use Jakarta. As I said, supports also Jakarta EE 10. And then you have that dependency on that integration testing to unintended public release of a vulnerability injection. It shows here as vulnerable because they are not ready to release 2.14. So but actually, I'm not using any kind that is vulnerable. But OK, that's the way the world works today. You're informed by any issue that might happen. Where are my tests? My test is here. Same thing. I have here the integration test, but now I'm annotated with a container integration test so that the annotation for the JUnit 5 extension that and I just need to say I want to have my application running in Payara Micro. So for those hardcore people that say, well, I want to run it now with Wildfly, then you can just change it and it runs, your application runs in Wildfly under test. So you can really test out that portability without the need to change any of your dependencies. Still using that REST client because I find it interesting, but I want to use something real. I want to use a external service which returns me that interest rate value. So I'm using WireMock. People are aware what WireMock is? A few. So it's here I'm using it as a Docker container. You can use it in API test pure as an API. Also, that's a capability of configuring a response for a certain URL. So my application now, for the first time, it actually, my calculator again, inject this one, where I actually call a remote service with microprofile REST client, but actually it just calls a external endpoint, which I configure here locally. In production, I can specify, of course, other URLs, but locally and under test, I'm calling the host remote port 8080 and then my interest URL, which does not exist, of course. But the nice thing, at least I believe it's a nice thing because I've created it, sorry. But the nice thing that I can say, okay, WireMock is used and is using this host within my Testcontainers environment. So this remote then, of course, needs to match the URL that we have here. And then we can configure our response saying if you do a get method on interest, then we return 6.99. Nice. So on the fly, you can configure your WireMock container, what it should return. Before I release that 1.1 version, I will also support JSON, so that now it's a bit quirky that you just have to return a string. But then you can calculate again from your test your application which is running in the Docker container. The Docker container contacts then the WireMock for the interest rate value and calculates it and returns everything back. For me, but people might agree, and that's fine. For me, that's how I would like to work if I'm doing integration testing. You have control over everything. You can configure everything. If you want to have your other container, and then you can create a other static for instance, another Payara microcontainer. So you have another application which is running, which you don't want to mock, for instance. So you have then let's call it second app. No, I'm not going to do it because this is used as the host for second app. So this will be the host name on which it is exposed. And you can just say new Payara microcontainer, and you can Docker image name parse, and you can define app to version 1.0, for instance, and you're using that container for your dependency. Well, that's one nice thing. Other nice thing what I said is, yeah, but there is something wrong, and I want to debug it. Okay. Start it up in debug mode, the entire test. What does it do? So it starts up the entire environment, and then it waits for a remote debug connection. It waits a little bit longer, and no, is it gone? It is gone. Okay, quickly. Here is my remote debug application. Apply. Because I only have 60 seconds, and then the system says, "Oh, I've waited too long. You went for a coffee, so break it up." I'm now connected with the debugger to that system. If everything is correct, I have a breakpoint. So at some point, my debugger stops on that breakpoint within my calculate monthly amount here. So I can see what is going on. I can follow it step by step during the execution of the test. Developer experience, they call it these days. So that's something that I find nice. As I said, I'm biased. So for me, what is the preferred test environment, integration test environment with Jakarta EE? Well, unit testing, JUnit 5, well, JUnit for that first step, for those business logic, because there you can have faster and easier access to what you're testing. And then the integration testing framework that I just showed you. Let's see if someone asks a question. Room 9. I did not try it out, so yeah, thank you. What frameworks have you contributed to under Jakarta EE? So most of the work I did around the security API. As I said, I'm one of those weird guys that like security. So I'm also responsible for Soteria implementation. So that's what I worked most of the time with under Jakarta EE. Any modules planned to be withdrawn from the Jakarta EE in the future? Well, they are talking about that a long time already, but EGB is a candidate to be removed from the entire platform because most of the things are now in CDI. Is Weld similar to Mockito? No, so Weld is, as I mentioned, it is the CDI container, so Mockito is not. It's just for testing, as Weld is there for the CDI container. What server is used for running the apps? Glassfish. With the Archillian one, it was Glassfish. The ones on Testcontainers, it was Payara Micro, but as I said, you can use it with Wildfly, Payara Micro, Open Liberty, and Glassfish, so you can choose. For Glassfish, there is a bit limited support sometimes because they are not exposing by default Docker images, so you have to create your own Docker image so that it can run in Testcontainers. How to debug one failing parameter of many in a parameterized test? That's a good question. I have no idea. Probably by modifying your argument provider, which is not really a good thing. Because then you can just hit a breakpoint, or you can have those conditional breakpoints if you say that the breakpoint only needs to be activated when your value is a certain thing, then that's also an option. But yeah, that's a nice one. How to start testing? Is there any good testing patterns for start? I would say that you should try to find a, but then from a business logic, find a scenario which goes through each path. So if that's the idea of that mutation testing, that you should have a test for each path. So if the conditions for a path are altered dynamically in that mutation testing, then your test should fail. So look at your code, see through the if-then-else structures, but also the other structures, what different paths your code can go, and write a reasonable test for that with reasonable values. That for me, I think, is a reasonable start. If that's the answer to the question, I'm not 100% sure. How can we differentiate the mock and the real method invocation in this context? Well, for mock, yeah, you just need to provide a return value. So if you want to know if you are using the mock or not, then yeah, that is something that you should rely on and know how you have set it up. If you really want to know if you're using the mock or not, I'll just throw a runtime exception and see if everything blows up. That's what I do. That's the easiest way to see if your mock is used or not. Try to blow up the things, and then you know if it was that used. And when you know it's used, then you can put a real value, reasonable value in it. Is recreating a stateful container for each test a good practice in test containers? Yes and no, because yes, you should recreate your database, because for each set of tests, not every test case probably at every test method, but for each, at least each test class, you should have a predefined state of your database, because you don't want that your database contains anything that you do not expect. So you always need to have a certain controlled data set, so that you know that it matches with what you're expecting in your test. So that can be indeed an issue of performance if you each time start up with a new database for each test and need to populate it. I agree. So try to make a balance in that. Try to strike a balance in that. Any difference between REST client and REST client, with or without capitals? Yes, that was intentional. The ones with the lowercase is the official microprofile one, which you are using in your code. The with capitals is the one that you're using in your test, which is behaving slightly different. So that's why there was a difference. Sorry for going over time. Sorry to delay your start of the evening with a few minutes. Thank you for watching, for those that are watching the recording. If you want to have more information about @bash and what I do, so @bash.be or the GitHub repo, where you can find all my code that I try to have fun with. And so I hope you have fun on this conference and with what you do in your life and coding, etc. Thank you.